Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America. On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, we talk to prominent US citizens not just about their country's past and present, but also about its future. What, I ask my American guests, will be the 21st century fate of their now venerable republic? Hello everybody, welcome back to Keen on America. We are once again in Austin, Texas today, speaking with Jacob Howland, the provost of the new university there, the University of Austin at Texas. And as always on Keen on America, I began our conversation with Jake by asking him when and where he was born.
My name is Jacob Howland, and I was born in Philadelphia in November of 1959.
Jake, do you consider yourself an American?
Yes, I do.
What does that mean to you?
It means that I'm a patriot. I believe in the American experiment. I think that the Constitution provides a framework for individual liberty and for human flourishing. That's basically what it means to me.
Jake, you're a historian of philosophy with expertise in antiquity, particularly in the philosophy of Greek antiquity. Is there something unique about the American experiment?
For sure. I mean, first of all, the Founding Fathers were well acquainted with ancient experiments in liberty. Alexander Hamilton read Plutarch. They knew about ancient Athens, where democracy was born. They had studied the Roman Republic. And what I find most important is the system of checks and balances, the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. I think it's an ingenious mechanism for allowing space for ordered liberty, but keeping vice in check, keeping ambition and the natural tendency of human beings to take shortcuts when they have power, keeping that in check. So I'm very grateful to live in this wonderful country, which was designed by such intelligent and thoughtful men.
How intimately well acquainted, Jake, were the founders with antiquity and with the Renaissance city-states of Italy that political philosophers like Machiavelli wrote about? How grounded in history, in other words, is the American political experiment?
Well, I'm not an American historian, so I can't speak for all the founders, but I do know that they were familiar in particular with the English political tradition. And they also knew the Bible, which is important, because in the English writings, when republicanism was sort of coming into its own, there was a lot of discussion and debate, not just about Roman republicanism, for example, but about the Hebraic Republic. As you probably know, in the Hebrew Scriptures, there's a warning against kingship, and I think they were influenced strongly by the classical and biblical political tradition. But it really depends, who you're talking about. I mean, Hamilton, for example, didn't have that many books. One of them was Plutarch. I actually think that might not have been the best thing for him, because I wonder whether the example of men who sought glory and were willing to risk their lives for it might have influenced him to enter into the duel with Aaron Burr, even though he wasn't intending on shooting him.
Jake, you are an educator and an innovator. We'll come to your current experiment in Austin in a few minutes. But we talked about the influence of antiquity on the American Republic, on the founders. How central was the idea of education, do you think, in the formation of the Republic?
Well, I think the founders embraced at least some aspects of the ancient conception of education. So, for example, the ancient Athenians had this notion of paideia, which incorporates the word pais, which is child. And it was an education in civic virtue. Now, the founders, of course, were influenced by, let's say, more classical or classically liberal positions. And they didn't set up a polity that was designed like ancient Sparta, let's say, or ancient Athens, to inculcate strongly a particular set of virtues. But at the same time, they presupposed the existence of those virtues. So, for example, from the perspective of Jefferson, you have a notion of a landed aristocracy that might be reflected, for instance, in the Senate as opposed to the House of Representatives. A kind of notion of, I wouldn't quite say noblesse oblige, because the Americans were, breaking away from a system of stratified society that we saw in England. But there is still a kind of underlying notion of a system that was designed to operate optimally for virtuous individuals. I would actually connect this with Tocqueville, who comes to the United States in the 1830s and observes the real importance of religion as a kind of context in which political and civil virtues were formed. And Tocqueville argues explicitly that religion is central to American democracy, which raises the question of what happens when that kind of deep cultural formation is absent. Perhaps today we're seeing some of the fruits of that absence.
We've done shows, Jake, in the past from authors who've written books like How to Educate a Citizen, How to Create an American Citizen. Is that one of the primary roles, do you think, of the American education system, to create citizens?
I think it is. It's a subject of some debate today. But the fact is that any educational system is going to, even if only implicitly, develop certain virtues and present certain models for students. So, for example, at the University of Austin, we are committed to...
And this is, of course, your startup we're going to come to in a second.
Yes. We are committed to the pursuit of truth. And, of course, we also believe that truth is optimally pursued under conditions of open discourse, civil discourse. Now, that might sound like a fairly thin basis for a discussion of virtue, but in fact, if you're going to have a kind of pluralistic, open discourse conducted civilly, you're actually presupposing a number of things. I mean, first, with respect to the pursuit of truth, you're presupposing the desire to understand truth, and also the belief, incidentally, that there is truth to be discovered if one makes an effort to do so, and that's accessible in part and in principle to those who seek it. But in addition, if you sort of expand on this, you've got a notion of, say, humility, right? Intellectual humility. You've got a notion of patience, because you're not going to immediately sit down and have a dialogue with other people about justice or political policy and achieve results instantly. And you've got a number of other virtues that I think are essential for the pursuit of truth. Now, if you have an institution that doesn't prioritize the pursuit of truth, but let's say political homogeneity, you're presupposing another set of well, we could call it virtues, we could call it habits, we could call it sort of settled dispositions. Any educational system is going to form souls according to the things that it esteems.
Is education, though, Jake, particularly in America, is it just in the business of, using some of your recent language, forming souls? The heart of the American enterprise, in some ways it seems, is personal invention and reinvention, a kind of renewal, a very different kind of way of treating human nature as was traditionally achieved. Are those two things compatible?
I think they are, and let me go back and say a little bit more with regard to your earlier question about citizenship. The bet here is that a flourishing society requires a deeper and deeper understanding of truth and an application of that understanding to the particular historical circumstances in which people find themselves. And so what I was suggesting is, at least indirectly, a contribution to American citizenship. Now, but with the caveat that we at the University of Austin, which we'll talk a bit more about soon, are not interested in graduating students who embrace political dogma. We want people to think for themselves, but again, we feel that a healthy polity is one in which individuals do think for themselves and come into the public space and share their best understanding of what is just and unjust, or advantageous and disadvantageous. With regard to innovation, first let me say there are many reasons to go to college. So if we move the discussion to the question of what universities are for, they're for many things. They're for being trained in a particular area of employment, therefore earning a credential in that area that can sort of, one can present as one's bona fides to work in a particular area. Therefore, being liberally educated in a kind of classical sense, which I'm going to return to in a minute. But they're also for preparing graduates to enter into an uncertain economy and make their way and be successful in their careers. And I want to connect the last two things. What is the relationship between a liberal education and a preparation to innovate and to come up with new ideas? Very briefly, we believe that people have to, like rowers, to prepare for the future, they have to look back like a rower in order to move forward. And what I mean by that is that some of the very, very best ideas, perhaps the majority, come from folks who are well acquainted with what has already transpired in their fields, or even in general across the sort of human record of accomplishment. The past and the sort of precious legacy that we receive from our ancestors of knowledge, accumulated by suffering and struggle, wisdom, is the most fertile soil for future inventions and developments. At least that's the way that we approach education. So we try actually to combine these two things, a broad-minded understanding of the past and of the best that has been thought and said and built and created, and an ability to connect things together in imaginative ways, and the future, which is going to require us to innovate and to come up with solutions for the particular circumstances of our lives at any given time.
Jake, you spent most of your life in the traditional American education system. You were a professor at a college, you got your PhD in political philosophy, and now you are part of this innovative, or at least you would call it innovative. Some people might suggest it's a reactionary startup in Austin. We'll come to it in a second. But do you believe that the traditional American education system has become, and I choose these terms carefully, illiberal and un-American?
Unfortunately, I think that is the case. I've been observing this for some time. I would say that most Americans were not particularly acquainted with the problems that you're pointing to until October 7th.
October 7th, what year?
October 7th, 2023, when...
Last year, basically.
Yes, last year, exactly. So this was, of course, the date on which Hamas terrorists invaded Israel and committed sort of, thousands of murders and rapes and so forth. And Americans were shocked by the reaction on campus, where professors and students and administrators celebrated these barbaric attacks. And as of today, and we're talking now on the 20th of August, 2024, we've seen 5 Ivy League university presidents resign, 4 of them directly because of their inability to handle the turmoil on campus. I mention this because it was a shock to Americans that very radical ideas were being embraced by students and by professors, and that these universities, which are supposed to be places of teaching and learning, were allowing these disruptions to create obstacles to the central activity of a university. In general, so let me step back from October 7th and say, for years now, students have been reporting, and it's the majority of students, that they have bitten their tongues, that they're very careful in class about what they say because they don't want to be reported by their fellow students or punished by their professors for views that are unpopular. They don't want to be canceled. I was speaking with actually a producer from 60 Minutes recently who spent a year at Harvard on a journalism fellowship, and she was really dismayed by the way students censored their own comments, by the very narrow window of opinions that they were willing to offer in class. I think that the classroom has been invaded by ideology, and the result is that real education becomes extremely difficult, because in order to be educated, like, for example, to learn how to ride a bike, you got to be able to make mistakes. You can't learn how to ride a bike if you're not allowed to fall off. We learn through our mistakes, and students are afraid of making mistakes, and so they bite their tongues, and I think that's very unfortunate.
Doesn't this go back, though, well before what happened in Israel, Gaza last year? Alan Bloom wrote his Closing of the American Mind. It was a bestseller, and there have been many books like that since. Aren't Americans, particularly conservative Americans, always worried about the universities, and yet they remain the dominant universities in the world? Americans don't tend to want to go to overseas universities, maybe occasionally Oxford and Cambridge, but most smart kids from China, from India, from Europe, they all want to come to America. So where's the real evidence for you that there is this crisis, broadly leaving aside what's happened over the last few months?
Well, look, let me start with Alan Bloom. Of course, his book, The Closing of the American Mind, he described American students as a kind of blank slate. But I do want to remind you that he enjoyed the eagerness of these blank slates. They were ready to receive information. I would say that that's not really the case today. Universities have become fairly joyless places, which is a real problem. People are always looking over their shoulders at who might hear them say the wrong thing. But let me go back. Here's some evidence. I'll give you 2 pieces of evidence. One is that core curricula have been very badly watered down. We know that Jesse Jackson in the late 80s led chants of protesters on the Stanford University campus saying, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go." And the Stanford Western Civ program was cut. We know that...
Didn't he have a point in a sense, though? Maybe he doesn't want to cut the whole thing, but wasn't it a bit too central back then?
I'm not sure about that. If the point is that we need to study other cultures, I certainly agree with that, although I'm not aware that Stanford was lagging behind in the study of, say, South Asian or East Asian culture or African. But in any case, I would say that it's very important for students to understand the West, because they are Western, and because everything in our contemporary world has antecedents and precedents and can be seen in 3 dimensions only if we understand the roots of the lives that we live today. But let me give you another example. So Columbia had a core curriculum that's been watered down, and instead of reading, as Matthew Arnold puts it, the best that has been thought and said, Columbia is restricting, in many cases, its students to contemporary writings that, on the one hand, have not stood the test of time, and on the other hand, are really useful only for a kind of liberal or left liberal perspective on events and affairs. It's not the kind of breadth that you need. But let me give you another alarming piece of evidence, and that is that, if you ask most Americans, what do you think the ratio of conservatives to liberals is on campus? Their estimates are roughly 2 to 1. That is, there are 2 liberal professors for every conservative professor. And I hasten to say, by the way, that I'm not particularly interested in the politics of this, except for the fact that political affiliation is a marker or an indicator of intellectual orientation to a significant extent. The reality is that on average in most fields it's more than 12 to 1, liberal to conservative, and in some fields, especially in the humanities and social sciences, it can be 60 to 1 or more. Now what does that mean? It means that departments hire professors who share their political leanings. And that means that if, as I said, and I believe this can be shown, there is a kind of correlation between political affiliation and intellectual interests and concerns and knowledge, then what's happening is that the space of intellectual activity is narrowing. It's not as pluralistic, and it's not as rich. And
not as American, not as liberal as you would like.
Well, yes, liberal in the classical sense, right? That is to say, diverse, intellectually diverse. Now, we hear a lot about diversity on campus, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the diversity tends to be not diversity of intellect or spirit, but really other markers, racial, sexual orientation.
Are they real? People use this term DEI. Some people support it strongly, others see it as the root of everything that's gone wrong with America. Do you believe in these terms? Are they valuable, Jake?
Well, I would say that, you asked at the beginning of your question whether they were real. Let me address that. They are very real in the sense that many, many universities require DEI statements, both for professors who are initially being hired and for promotion. Now, the conception of diversity is, as I said, quite narrow. Then we have the word equity, which is different from equality, because sort of built into the notion of equity is equality of outcomes. And we have the notion of inclusion. It all sounds very good, and I'm all for an inclusive campus. But if it is the case that you have departments, especially at leading universities, where there might be a large department of 40 people in a history or sociology program, let's say, and 0 conservatives, you are actually excluding. So I favor intellectual diversity. I favor old-fashioned equality, that is equality of opportunity. I don't think we should attempt to engineer absolutely equal outcomes. We don't do that in areas that are very important to America, or to Americans, particularly sports. And when we talk about inclusion, that's often a phrase that really means including the kind of people that we want included, but not including those that we don't.
Jake, you're an academic. You've been grading papers all your life. I'm sure you're a traditionalist and you believe in the value of giving people A's, B's, C's, D's, sometimes even failing them. What grade would you give the current state of America? Some people are very down on America. I don't want to get into the whole Trump-Harris debate at the moment, but how would you grade the current condition of America? Would it get a C, a B?
It's a rather abstract question, so let me start.
I apologize.
Let me start with something concrete. I think Americans are somewhat despairing right now. I don't believe, you mentioned Trump and Harris, so let me just, I won't talk about them, but let me just say this. I think many, many Americans are not happy with the leadership displayed by either of the big parties, Democratic and Republican. I think that they're fearful about the future. I think that they're anxious, and I think they're tired. They've really been pummeled by, look, COVID, the COVID lockdowns, which had many deleterious effects, small businesses going out of existence in unheard of numbers, children not being able to get the education that they need, and in fact we're still paying for that. This generation fell behind. Overspending by the government, inflation, the economy. I mean, people can't believe how quickly you can spend $100 in the grocery store. The increasingly unstable international order. The question is, can we get our act together? And I think this is a great concern for Americans. So, I mean, I would want to assign grades sort of to the American people. To
certainly wouldn't get an A there, it doesn't sound like, Bill.
I'm not going to give anybody an A on this one,
Good. Well, and it was a bit of a setup, Jake, I have to admit.
Sure.
Because I was going to go on and say, certainly America is not in its ideal state, probably never has been, probably never will be. Mm-hmm. But a lot of critics of America point to certain institutional crises, a kind of perfect storm. There's the medical system, there's the dysfunctionality of the state, and then of course there's the education system.
Yeah.
That's your thing. How central do you think the problems in the education system, especially the further education system, which you've dedicated to your life to, how important is what at least you see, the bureaucratization, the intellectual lack of diversity, the intolerance, the fear? How central is that in the problems of America of the 2020s?
Well, Andrew Sullivan wrote an article in 2018 that said we're all on campus now. And now that already is 6 years ago now, so it was fairly prescient.
He's always been on campus, I don't know about everybody else.
Yes, well, what he was pointing to is the way that ideas that were sort of generated in the academy have spilled over into society at large. I probably should have started my answer to your last question about grading the United States with institutional dysfunction. I think it's pretty fair to say that most of our major institutions, maybe all of them, have somehow lost the thread. So for example, the media and the press. Their job is to report the truth. It's not to be an organ that represents the views of the government. The job of the government, especially the intelligence agencies, is to protect Americans, not to spy on them. The job of universities and schools is to educate, not to propagandize. And I think that education is absolutely central. The ancients understood that you get the people you educate, and that the quality of your society depends on the individuals, not on institutions. Look, you need good institutions, but there's a saying, personnel is policy, right? You've got to hire good people who are prepared to do the jobs that they're undertaking. And the university system, we can talk about K through 12, but let's talk about the university system, has been very important to the United States. It's been a hub of innovation. It's delivered, when you talk about the elite universities, it's delivered Supreme Court justices and leaders across industry and politics. Some people say to me, why don't we just abolish universities? And my answer to that is, well, I'm not smart enough to know what we could replace them with. And they are so central to our society that it seems like a much better bet to try to rebuild them. So, what happens on campus does ultimately affect what happens off of campus. And let me say that if you ask CEOs today, they're quite upset with recent graduates, because what they're looking for is people with excellent skills in communication, or even decent skills, writing, the ability to analyze and synthesize information, the ability to engage in teamwork, right? To embrace the culture of a corporation. They're not finding any of these things in the case of many graduates, because and instead what they're finding is young people coming into a corporation and saying things like, I'm happy to work here, but we don't agree with your values, and protesting and attempting to insert themselves into the culture.
But doesn't that suggest kids able to think for themselves? Isn't that a good thing?
Not necessarily, because I think a lot of the kind of agitation that we see is really a sort of groupthink. I mean, so we see this, for example, today, there's a big push, as you know, on the part of student bodies to divest from businesses that engage in economic activity with Israel. It turns out that a massive percentage of businesses of any significance do this. And to divest from them would simply mean to eliminate the portfolio, or a large percentage of it, in any university. I don't think there's any deep understanding of the way things actually work. So what happens is you get kind of ideological fervor that's not trained in and doesn't really have its fingers on the actual relationship between parts of the economy or between individuals in particular institutions. I think that the capacity to think for oneself has really been lagging behind. There's a great deal of conformity, which I think has been exacerbated by social media. In any case, education really is, and I'm talking about education in the West now, the development of an individual's capacity to be an active, reflective, confident center of action and responsibility. And I think individuality, which has been a concern of philosophical thinkers for centuries now. It shows up in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. He's very concerned about conformity. It shows up in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Individuality has really fallen by the wayside. That is to say, the confidence and courage that is required to stake out one's own path, which was much celebrated by Tocqueville in the 1830s, has really diminished.
Yeah, and I would distinguish Tocqueville, who focused on the participatory quality of the American citizen, versus Mill, who was more focused on thought, although they were in sync on many fronts. And I think Mill wrote very approvingly of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So, Jake, what are you doing now to change all that? You're part of this very interesting experiment going on in Austin. You've raised almost $200 million. You've had a lot of press. Some people are suggesting what you're doing is a return to the conformity of the 1950s. Others suggest that you're the future of education. Do you see what you're doing in Austin as radical, as revolutionary, as reinventory, or as conservative, or a mix of all of them?
It has both innovative and conservative elements. So there are really three pillars of the education at the University of Austin. One is the Intellectual Foundations program. And full disclosure, I am the Dean of the Intellectual Foundations program, and I largely designed the program.
So it better be good, Jake.
It better be good, yep. I own it, for better or worse. And this is a sequence of 15 courses that focus on fundamental questions. In the first term, students will take a course called Chaos and Civilization. What is civilization? Why do we need it? Where did it come from? And we're examining, ancient stories, the Hebrew Bible, Hesiod's Theogony, Homer, that show that it emerged in various ways out of chaos. Another course is the beginning of politics. What is politics? Are human beings political animals? Are we just a band of wolves? What is law? So sort of focusing on fundamental issues with a kind of historical arc. And reading a mix of primarily classic works. So for example, when we're studying modernity, we're reading Descartes and Hobbes and Rousseau and people like this. But also interspersed with more recent works, sort of to keep the students on.
It sounds wonderful. In fact, if I was younger, I'd probably apply myself. But is this particularly different from what the University of Chicago did in the 60s, 70s, 80s?
Not really, but here's the thing. That's just one pillar. So the students, the freshmen and sophomores, spend about 60% of their time taking intellectual foundations, and the rest they can begin to prepare for entry into one of our centers of academic inquiry, okay, where they're going to get more specialized education. But the real innovation at the University of Austin is something called the Polaris Project, named after the North Star. And it's a 4-year project to do, make, create, discover, build something that is going to serve human flourishing, something that is going to serve the human good, that is going to make life better for people. Now, that's what I would call the sort of forward-looking, innovative aspect of our curriculum. And students will be strongly aided by the particular kinds of knowledge they receive in, let's say, their particular center of inquiry. So technological, scientific information, and so forth. So at the heart of the University of Austin is something I think that is new. And that is this, what I hope will be a creative tension between the past and the future, between the legacy of knowledge and wisdom, historical knowledge, philosophical, anthropological, religious, scientific of the past, and innovation, the skills and techniques of knowledge that allow us to make our trackless way into the future. The image I have for this is the Roman god Janus, who has two faces, looks backward and looks forward. And again, to return to something I said earlier, the bet is that the richest growths of the future emerge from the soil of the past. You can see this, for example, in music. The Beatles, they knew about rhythm and blues and soul and all these kinds of things. Any area where somebody really stands out, they tend to have mastered what came before, whether it's painting or music or literature. Speaking of literature, if students want to learn to write, I tell them, read the Bible, especially the Hebrew scriptures, all the big stories, all the fratricidal emotion.
That doesn't sound very radical, though, Jay.
That's not particularly radical, but here's the question. Suppose you wanted let's take something like artificial intelligence, okay? Computing is a big part of our curriculum at the University of Austin. Students we're hoping to build a really cutting-edge computing program. Artificial intelligence is obviously central to computing. Question: would you like the people who are going to make the greatest advances in artificial intelligence, which after all is a tool that is designed to assist human beings, to have a capacious, rich, broad, deep understanding of what it is to be a human being, of human good, of human aspirations, of human character, of civilization, of politics, of society? Or would you like them simply to have excellent technical expertise in designing artificial intelligence?
You talk about tech. You're in Austin, one of the startup capitals of the United States. Mm-hmm. I know you're a big admirer of some of the innovations in Israel, the startup nation. We've done shows on that. walking around the campus, which is opening next month in September, it has a kind of startup quality. Is that one of the radical elements, Jake, in what you're trying to do in Austin, that you're making a university into a startup? You've some of the financial backing you have, some of the money is coming from Silicon Valley.
Mm-hmm. Look, we're located in Austin for a good reason. This really is a hub of startup, venture capital. There are many, many intelligent people here who are bringing the best ideas to market. And what we realized, or what I realized early on, is that the University of Austin is a startup. In fact, it's also a Polaris project. I mentioned earlier that the Polaris projects are supposed to aid human flourishing. And we saw a problem, which is the failure of the American Academy in general, and decided that we needed to do something about it, and that was to build a new university. And, you know, startup culture is interesting. It involves people who are strongly dedicated to the work and work at high speed. We've brought this campus. We've gone from 0 to 1. That is from just an idea on the back of a napkin, literally, to opening our doors in under 3 years. And that means that we're working at breakneck speed. And that means that we make mistakes. And there's a kind of startup mentality, which is people don't simply occupy a single role. You've got to be ready to do anything that's necessary to move the ball forward. And when you make mistakes and when you fail, you've got to be able to figure out what you did wrong and try to do better. So there's a kind of a culture that I think actually relates closely to education. Because education, I mentioned earlier, you've got to be able to make mistakes. There is an education that is undergone by people who attempt to launch a startup. And there are sayings in startup as well, you know, like fail fast. Someone might say, why would you want to fail at all?
Break things, fail fast, and break things.
Break things and fail fast.
Which isn't one of, probably Mark Zuckerberg was rather regretful of saying that. It's certainly, books have been written critiquing him on that, just around that observation.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know about the break things, but the fail...
Move fast and break things.
Yeah, the fail fast part is if you're going down the wrong path, learn it quickly and readjust. Now, the thing about education is that here we're taking in these 18-year-olds. They don't know necessarily what they want to do. They've got to experiment, and they've got to stick with things and then see, is this building my interest? Is this nourishing my soul? And especially when they undertake their Polaris projects, the idea is to give them genuine criticism. We have something called the talent network, and these are sort of external advisors and corporations that will help them with their projects and give them honest feedback. And that requires a kind of boldness and a willingness to do your best, fail, try again, fail better. That's, by the way, a phrase from Samuel Beckett that I like. And that's really what education is about. That's why I say, you know, you can get an education by going out and trying to start a new corporation. You can get an education by reading books. We're going to try to combine those two sorts of things in different ways for different students, so that they will have the kind of background that allows them to connect ideas across disciplines, to see things whole, but then to get out there and try to apply that learning to the problems of today. And, you know, so it's not just a question of, I don't know, reading Plato and Aristotle and the philosophers and Freud and whoever and trying to understand what a human being is, but now trying to do something with that knowledge, you know. It's not just a question of reading political theory and understanding the American political system, but trying to do something within that system that's going to improve it. So this is the sort of creative, tension-filled space that we've established at the University of Austin, and I think it's going to be an exciting experiment.
Certainly, you've been very generous with your time, Jake. One final question: you used the term 0 to 1. That was the title, of course, of Peter Thiel's best-selling work. Thiel is a controversial thinker. I'm not sure how aware he is of your experiment or whether you've talked to him. But he seems to be promoting a 21st century libertarian ideal of a society as detached from the state, a self-regulating society, an unregulated world. Some people might be suspicious of what you're trying to do at the university here in Austin, that you're kind of conforming to that libertarian ideal of unregulation. The traditional university, of course, as you suggest, is probably overregulated, too many bureaucrats. I think most university bureaucrats might even acknowledge that. But is there a danger in what you're doing in this startup culture, startup university, startup nation that you're trying to replicate in Austin? Is there a danger of going the other way and contributing to a libertarian dystopia where there's no authority and the state has essentially disappeared?
I don't think there's much danger of that. I mean, let me go back to our earlier discussion of American citizenship and virtue. You know, the problem with, let's say, a kind of extreme libertarianism is that societies are not simply places where people living in the same location engage in economic activity and agree to some sort of defensive alliance. They exist for the sake, as Aristotle said, of the good life, of a meaningful, substantial existence in which our human capacities can flourish. And that requires a thicker conception of good habits, of virtue, than libertarians embrace. And I believe that's going to be what they take from the Intellectual Foundations program. I would say the Polaris Project, simply by focusing on the notion that there is such a thing as human flourishing, that human beings can live better or worse lives, depending on the resources that are available to them and the innovation that's available to them. That notion itself points toward the limitations of a kind of purely unregulated society in which, you know, everyone's free to do whatever he wants as long as it doesn't hurt me in any direct way. Now, what that looks like, our students, the next generation, they're going to have to figure that out going forward. But what we want to do is give them the tools and resources to understand that that is a question of the relationship between the state and the citizen, between the individual and society, and that it needs to be answered by every generation, and it needs to be answered thoughtfully. And you know, again, I'm not particularly concerned that we're going to end up with some sort of an institution that simply graduates libertarians who go around and preach the gospel of libertarianism, and that's certainly not our objective.
And Jake, for those who want to know more about what you're trying to do, where should they go?
Well, they should go to our website, UAustin.org, and they'll find a lot of information. They can sign up for our newsletter and get regular communications from us, and I hope that many of your listeners will indeed look into finding out more about us.